All right, we're recording. This is the Gateway API meeting for June 29. And I think we have a pretty light attendance today. So I think the answer here is going to be that most people I'm seeing on this call could probably attend or have attended the later afternoon, well, Pacific afternoon time meeting time. So we've been alternating between a Europe-friendly time zone and a more APAC-friendly time zone. And it seems like we're getting better attendance for the afternoon meetings for the APAC time zone. So I'm leaning towards switching all meetings to this later time. Of the people that have attended this meeting, is there anyone that couldn't make the later meeting time? Cool. All right. Well, I think I'll move forward with that idea. I'll check in Slack as well with the broader group, but just based on who's been attending these different meeting times, it seems like we'll get better attendance and participation in the later one. On that note, the next meeting, at least at Google, and I think at many American companies, is a holiday. So I'm leaning towards canceling it. I think the attendance would be pretty low. I think we'd be on pace for a July 5, which is obviously not the 4th, but I think the 4th got extended and basically most companies are giving the 5th. So given that, I think we should just cancel the next meeting. Would anyone be around if we did have a meeting?
Nope.
Okay, sounds good. I'll plan on canceling that one then. Cool. All right. So a lot of this discussion today, I wanted to go through a doc I'd put together. Many of you were probably at the meeting Nick led last week. Unfortunately, I missed that, but I did watch the recording and I chatted with him after about selection policy. And just to jog your memory, this is the idea of selection policy was, can we take these concepts of, cross namespace selection and bump it out to another resource? And he had a good example. I think we've gone back and forth between reference policy or selection policy. I'm not very opinionated about the name here. But you can see the general idea here was that I want this object to be to allow references from this other resource or set of resources in this other namespace. There were variations of this, but this was the idea. Instead of trying to inline this on a resource, you could put this out into a different resource. And I think this gave us a lot of flexibility. It gives us the ability to not just control gateway resources, but it, things like service that are relevant to gateway, but not controlled completely in the scope of this API, or even reference to a certificate secret, this more generic proposal could help with. So I wanted to explore this and see how it would work. And I also wanted to expand on all the previous discussion, but this is just the Cliff Notes version of reference policy if anyone else wasn't able to make it last week. So I chatted with Nick some and came up with something similar to that, but my goal for a while had been to try and make sense of all the things that we've talked about that all seem like they're related and building on each other, and how can we put this all together? So previous meetings covered selection policy. I think that's the most recent and relevant here, but also covered cross namespace forwarding, route inclusion, and gateway to route binding. And so for cross namespace forwarding, I'm talking about the ability to forward traffic from a route to a service, or I guess any backend in another namespace, but we're primarily concerned about service. And then route inclusion is the idea of I want to include a route in a different namespace. So I think the primary use case for that is I have this path, let's say /foo, and I want to delegate it to namespace foo. So we already have the idea of delegating by domain with gateway listeners, but we don't have the ability to delegate by path. And so route inclusion would allow us to delegate by path. So those were the ideas, and there's been a lot of discussion on this already. And this doc just tried to illustrate some of the options we had for connecting all these pieces, because I think this really is one of the biggest things we need to get right out of V1 Alpha 2. We've spent a lot of time discussing how all these different pieces need to interconnect. And I wanted it to be somewhat sensible and really consistent. So we've talked about all of these kind of in isolation, and I was trying to come back through and make a summary doc of how all these things could fit. So with that, I think the idea is at a minimum, we want to provide a way for the following to safely cross namespace boundaries: gateway to route or route to gateway, depending on your perspective, and then route to route and route to service. And then kind of as a nice to have, it would be really cool if we could include secret references in this, but I don't think that's completely critical. It's just, that there is some level of interest, I don't know how significant, in the idea that I want to store all my certs in namespace foo and have them referenced from routes or gateways in other namespaces. That one feels a little bit less critical, but that is also something that I know has been brought up in the past. So before I get into any of these proposals, any questions, thoughts, comments? Cool. All right, I'll keep running. So the first proposal I had here is, direct references from route. And this proposal really just makes route the center of everything, and everything flows from
Rob, sorry, I just had a meta comment if we were going to reserve some time at the end to just go through issues and PRs.
Yeah.
Just to touch them.
Yeah, absolutely. I think this is going, that's a good, let me time box this for real. In my mind, I thought this would be a relatively quick thing, but I could be very wrong there. So let me try and time box this for another 25 minutes. And if we hit that time, so for me, that's around 10:35. And if we hit that time, we'll move on to other things. Does that sound fair?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Yeah, good call. Okay, so first off here, the idea is if route is central, that means route is pointing up to gateway. So route attaches to gateway, but route can also include other routes and forward to services. So this is fairly similar to our existing model. And I should note, this isn't entirely clear, but in this model, we have to have kind of this direct reference, and then the blue arrows pointing back are representing the other side of the handshake, the this is okay side. So you have a direct reference, and then the other side is saying, I trust this namespace, or I trust references from this namespace. So in this case, blue arrows represent the trust, and the darker gray arrows represent the actual reference. And you'll see that pattern throughout all the different diagrams I have here.
And Rob, the black arrow is a more explicit reference, and then the blue one is a more widely scoped reference, right?
Yeah, exactly. So in this case, because we're talking about direct references, I'm being, these references are route to this specific gateway and route to this specific route, whereas the blue arrows I'm discussing here are more I trust references from this namespace. And that's it. Just the namespace as a whole, I trust it. So that's That's what I'm trying to, this is one of, I think, 5 proposals in this doc. But essentially, you know, you look at the gateway, it's defining the namespaces they trust routes to bind from, and the route actually specifies the gateway they want to attach to. And similarly, routes include child routes very directly, and child routes can say, I trust references from store namespace in this case. And you see that same pattern for service. So to look at that a little bit more concretely, you can see something like that looks similar to our existing gateway model. And again, this is not trying to be too prescriptive about YAML. This is just, the YAML was kind of a detail I tacked on at the end, and this is the only proposal that has some YAML associated with it. I'm really just trying to get an idea of the directionality we want here and the high level concept, and then we can, you know, dig into YAML a bit more. But because this one seemed a little bit harder to visualize in my mind, I wanted to write down some basic YAML that could represent it. And the specifics, again, are not as important, I think, as just the concepts here. So in this case, the gateway is saying, I trust HTTP routes from this namespace or these namespaces. The HTTP route gets a new concept of attached to. And again, words can change, concepts can change. But with attached to, you're saying, I want to attach to kind gateway, so parent resource, but importantly, it's saying I can attach to other kinds. Maybe gateway is just our default value here, I don't know. And I want to attach to the gateway in namespace infra with the name LB, and then potentially, I don't know how common this will be, but potentially you may want to attach to a specific name of listener in the parent resource. So this would be a way to accomplish that. We've talked about these kind of section name references in other contexts as well. This feels very simple for the simple gateway example, where you have a single gateway that has, you know, a few listeners, and I just want to attach routes to it. It does admittedly get more complicated if you have a gateway with a dozen plus listeners and you have to specify the listener name every time you want to attach. That to me feels not as ideal, but this is just, you know, one option. Similarly, when you're talking about the route to route inclusion, again, you get this kind of direct reference. I want to include this specific route. And then the route uses the same kind of terminology as it did to attach to a gateway, but this time to attach to a route as a parent. So you can see this kind of relationship again. I include this route for this path, and then I attach backwards or upwards the same way I'd attach to a gateway. And then finally for service, the service gets a little bit more complicated because we don't have direct control over this API. And so you're kind of stuck with some kind of annotation. Of course, eventually this kind of thing could graduate to a field, but as long as we're relying on using these APIs directly without something like reference policy, we're stuck with some kind of annotation on these objects we don't directly control. So this is proposal 1. Let me stop for a second. There's a lot going on here. Any feedback or discussion before we move on? All right, I'll keep on going. So the next one is downward references, and this is really kind of most similar to what we have today. So gateway selects routes, and then these are the same. So route selects or includes route, service, and forwards to service. So this is very similar. I'd say this is almost identical to what we have today. So it should feel very familiar. I just wanted, I mean, obviously we don't have the ability to cross namespaces on this side, but if we were just going to extend the API as it exists today, it would be pretty trivial to add these concepts and move on. The concern I have with downward references is we've gotten at least some feedback that suggests that it's more natural to attach a route to a gateway than for a gateway to select routes. And I think that, to me at least, that also feels more indicative of what's actually happening. So a gateway can select things by label, which may give the illusion of control. But obviously, if you're a route owner, you ultimately control how you label your route. So you're still doing the attachment to gateway by how you label your route. It's more of how you phrase it than anything. But the end result is the same. The route owner is doing the attachment to gateway just in how they label their route instead of a explicit attached to kind of semantic. So then the next couple talk about reference policy. And reference policy is, again, that idea that Nick proposed. And I wanted to explore how that would work. And I think it works remarkably well with downward references. It's fairly easy to understand in my mind. So gateway selects routes. And in this case, instead of the route saying, I trust gateways from this namespace, the reference policy says, I trust gateways from this namespace. And similarly, instead of the route or service saying, I trust routes from this namespace, there's a reference policy object that trusts routes from that namespace. This feels like a really powerful concept. It works fairly well and is simple to understand with that kind of downward reference idea. The downside is that, again, for your simple use case, I just want to reference a route in another namespace. The examples that we've covered so far, the examples from the V1 Alpha 1 API would not require this additional resource. So again, for the simpler examples, you're creating more work with this additional resource. But the additional resource gives us more control with different RBAC, and it gives us a more generic way of referencing things like, say, secrets or other types. So that's reference policy and downward references. You can see below that, and naturally I tried the same thing, but tried to flip things around. So route referenced route and route referenced gateway. This works, but as you can see, it results in, I think, a more confusing end result, because you have to have your reference policy in the gateway namespace pointing down to the route. So I trust references from this route. Same for here. I trust references from this route, but then service can never be an upward reference because you're forwarding to it. So in that case, you have this kind of combination of upward and downward references, and it results in a relatively confusing story for reference policy. So that brings me to the last example that I have, which is kind of a hybrid of all the things. And that says, we'll do upward reference from gateway. So route is really still central. This is really, really similar to proposal 1, but the difference is we use reference policy for the route to route and route to service references. And obviously reference policy could be extended for other concepts as well. So I'll just take a quick moment and scroll back up to the top. You can see that the arrows are almost identical to proposal 1, but the idea again is that you're referencing, you're doing the trust references. These blue lines are coming from a single reference policy instead of the service and route itself. Yeah. So, there's another one. Thank you, Mark. Yeah, Mark, do you want to explain what you were thinking here?
I was just trying to kind of isolate some of the design characteristics of some of these options as you're going through them. Because something that's kind of present in every single one of them is, one, there's a type-based reference, which is kind of like the bare minimum. Like we have to specify what type is being referenced, just that has to be explicit. But then like the least specific version is just namespace based. And that would be like currently in the API, that's what we use, right? Unless if you don't have a label selector, it will select all of that type of resource within the namespace. And if you specify a different namespace, it'll select all of that type in that one. Next one up is the label-based reference, and the most specific is the direct resource reference. And these kind of exist to one degree or another in all of them. And then the next kind of characteristic is the inline versus a resource-based. I was just writing that up, which I guess I was trying to isolate the benefits that gives us, which I think the resource-based is one. It works for things more than just the route and the gateway, right? It works for referencing secrets. So that's one benefit. And then the other benefit is that it, trying to think. I think that was the primary one. Oh yeah, services. Services don't really have any kind of reference capability, so that would have to be annotation. So it basically makes it more consistent in having reference semantics for services and secrets, basically.
There is also the RBAC difference between inline and resource based.
Yeah, so what you're describing, Harry, is the idea that, so okay, let's pick on option 1 and option 5. So in this case, there's no way to control RBAC separately for these cross namespace references. If you control service in namespace, if you can write to services in this namespace and someone else can write to routes in this other namespace, you can do cross namespace references. Whereas what we're describing here is you may want to have someone else entirely, some kind of the idea of reference policy is similar in concept to network policy, where you can imagine an org admin saying, hey, I trust references from routes to services across these bounds. And so this feels like a more organizational policy than a specific reference, like doing it per service or per route or per anything like that.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Is that where you're going?
It separates like the RBAC of the reference from the resource itself, which allows like an administrator to control that policy separately.
Yeah, yeah. It's like separation of trust versus references itself.
Yeah, and I think that is highly valuable. What I've been trying to balance here is, I know we already have an API that is fairly complex, and I'm hesitant to add that kind of additional concept here. But I think the value it adds is pretty significant in the, this is kind of a hybrid system where you don't have it on this side and you do here. One of the things that reference policy, so the reason I should back up and describe why I didn't put reference policy on this side as a starting point. If you have an upward reference from route to gateway, you really want the gateway to be able to describe per listener which namespaces it trusts. So as an example, a gateway serves foo.com and bar.com. For foo.com, it trusts routes from the foo namespace, and from bar.com, it trusts routes from the bar namespace. And that's relatively difficult to communicate with a reference policy here, in this upward reference model. It's very straightforward when you have this, the downward reference from gateway to route. But again, the upward reference makes this rather complicated to get right. So that's why I kind of have this hybrid in proposal 5. Just anyway. With that said, do these options make sense? Is there a preference for a particular direction or approach that is standing out to anyone?
This is a lot to digest for me. I haven't been very closely following the whole discussion. So yeah, I don't have any specific comments.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, and originally when I was going into this, I thought, okay, so proposal 1 makes a lot of sense to me. It's all built in. It's a standard, no new resources, and it's consistent mostly. And it avoids any kind of confusion with selectors. You get direct references, so you know very clearly what you're referencing, and it's easier to communicate with status. If your selector doesn't select anything, it's unclear if that should be an error or not. Whereas if you have a direct reference and that doesn't match a resource, or the resource doesn't accept binding from you, then that's a very clear error message. So I like the direct references this allows and the lack of additional resources. But like you pointed out, Harry and Mark, the idea of reference policy is nice in the additional power it provides for any of these different options.
I lean towards like it provides additional power, but that comes at a greater cost. So like the trade-off, I'm not yet convinced that the trade-off makes sense.
I kind of agree. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, that's it. Go ahead.
I would say I'm kind of leaning towards number 5 because it does feel like we get to use reference policy for some aspects, basically just the more advanced ones, and essentially for like the more common use cases, 95% of use cases will not have to worry or think about this reference policy. Especially like I would hate for, like, this API is already complex, and I would really hate for their, especially if you have like 2 gateways and 2 routes that need to be bound to like an external gateway and an internal gateway, which is really common for like Knative example. For each route to also require reference policy, I think that we're not going to convince anybody to use this API. Like, they're going to look at it and they're going to say, that's more complex than Istio was in the first place. So why, and that's what I really worry about when we look at the reference policy. But this feels like it does kind of offer the best of both worlds.
Thanks. Yeah, and that was honestly, I kept on going between the 5th proposal and the 1st proposal. I like having reference policy as an option because it does allow endless extension points, really, like the idea that, hey, I might want to reference a secret in another namespace, and this provides a mechanism for doing that. And the thing that I'm hesitant about with proposal 5 is we'd have to have a very clear story for why we use reference policy for some cross namespace references and not all. And the story is, at least from my perspective, that the gateway to route has a very kind of unique relationship, and that you really want this to be per listener to route. And you want each listener to be able to trust a different set of namespaces. which is different than what we're discussing for the route to route, route to service, or anything else. So that's really, I think, the rationale for why there's differences here, but that may not be immediately obvious and may be confusing to some users that, you know, but I'd also agree with what you said, Mark, that 95% of users are going to end up using this route to gateway as the only means of crossing namespace boundaries, and the other ones are going to be, at least I would think, more fringe, less common examples than this. Okay. Yeah, so any more feedback? I know I said I was going to time box this in approximately 1 minute, which seems like about the right time. But any more thoughts or comments or preferences on this approach?
I think kind of like what Harry said earlier, it's just seeing this for the first time, it's hard to have a definitive view on it, but I think proposal 5 seems the appropriate way to go. But again, I need to spend a little bit more time looking at it and the implications.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. It takes a while to process this, and it sounds like there's enough interest in proposal 5 that I should. For me, it was helpful once I understood proposal 1 to try and sketch it out with some YAML just to understand, okay, what does this look like more concretely? I can do that with proposal 5 as well, just as a means of comparison.
That would be helpful.
Yeah, cool. And yeah, we can run with that, and definitely want to get some more eyes on this. But yeah, just this is really kind of what I see as the culmination of all these previous discussions and trying to shove them all together into something that makes sense. And I don't imagine this is going to be an easy process to get complete consensus on this, but hopefully this gets us a bit closer. Let me keep on moving then. So for V1 Alpha 2, I wanted to have a bit of a discussion around timeline here. I obviously am interested in getting V1 Alpha 2 out as soon as possible. I'm really hoping that we can get some good things in with V1 Alpha 2. We've had a lot of kind of core discussions here. And I think the big ones that we're trying to get in, or at least that I'd like to get in, are really a lot covered by that doc. So 1, 2, 3, the gateway route binding, route inclusion, and cross namespace forwarding are, all things we've discussed previously pretty heavily, and something that I tried to summarize in that doc. But I really want to get the contents of that, whatever proposal we choose or some new proposal, into V1 Alpha 2. I know Damien, it doesn't look like he's at this meeting, but I know Damien had proposed earlier the optional gateway class, and we had some discussions, but need to follow back up on this and see if it's something we want to include in V1 Alpha 2. And then finally, there's been a fair amount of discussion around, well, not that much, around policy attachment. And that's this large doc I shared a couple weeks ago now. Really, this is showing how we could attach policy, not just for the traditional ingress case that we've been very focused on, but also how this could apply for mesh. And there's been some good discussion in here. Oh, looks like I need to, I missed the follow-ups. I need to respond on these. So yeah, good discussion here, and encourage anyone to continue commenting if you've missed it. But this is something I also want to get in, and this is not really much or any API changes. I'm not sure. It's more of a pattern that I'd like to settle on, so that as we're extending the API, we're doing it in a consistent way across implementations. So all of these things I want to get into gateway enhancement proposals. This is a concept that Bowie has a PR for that I think is almost done. I think there's just one broken link left, and then it looked good to me. I think there may have been a couple other reviews that seem promising. But as soon as that gets in, I want to start taking some of these concepts and turning them into gaps so we can continue discussion there. Are there any changes that we haven't discussed yet? Like any things that are bothering someone with API that, you know, might be breaking changes that we either don't have in yet or haven't even discussed that we've completely missed?
I mean, there are smaller ones, and they are in the V1 Alpha 2 roadmap, or what do you call that? Milestone. Yeah.
Okay, that's a good segue into GitHub, if I can remember how to find the milestone. Okay,
yeah.
Um,
So a good one is, I think we want to rename the group.
Yep. That's a big
it's
one.
all the way to the bottom, I think. Yeah,
Yep.
change API group.
I meant to follow up on, thank you. Yeah, thank you for the reminder on this. I meant to follow up on this. I brought this up at SIG Network last week, and the overwhelming preference, well, it was somewhat of a preference in the meeting, but then some comments on the agenda afterwards made it pretty clear that this was the preference for API group. It doesn't sound like there's a strong preference within our working group for naming, and I think this is a very reasonable one. So unless there's any pushback to that, I'm fine with moving forward with this name.
A small gap would suffice, I guess.
Yeah. This would be another thing that would be good to get in there.
Is it a bit weird to have the kind and the group the same? Like it's gateway.gateway.networking.gateway.io.
Gateway.gateway. Yeah, I mean, I already have that. The terminology is difficult when you're talking about gateway API versus route API. It could be. I think the strong preference was for it to be something under networking.k8s.io. I mean, you could do gateway-API, but I don't think there's any precedence for API in this URL. And it feels weird to me to make up something else like routing.net, you know, that feels, unless we were trying to extend it with other things in the future, but I don't think so. I agree that's weird, but I don't have a great alternative either. Yeah, that's a good point. Let me link this in the agenda as something that is rather large and something we still need to get in. Were there other ones anyone was thinking of that seem? So this is this is route inclusion. This is mine. Okay, a lot of these are going to be covered in that discussion we just had. Harry, you're taking on redirects, which will come up soon in triage. Success reasons for conditions. This one, I don't think we've had any movement on that, but that's additive.
Yeah, there's like other minor breaking changes. I think there's one, again, another PR that requires, like, you want to drop the service name shortcut. I don't know how big of a breaking change we consider. I don't think it's like as big as the other ones that we were talking about. So yeah, there are other smaller ones that I think they exist in the backlog.
Yeah, as I'm looking through the issues we have in this milestone, it looks like almost half of them would get closed out if we chose a proposal from the doc today and got it in. Seems like close to half are related to that. Okay. Cool. So it seems like there's nothing too big that we're missing in scope for V1 Alpha 2. Thank you for the reminder on the API change. That is a big one. Cool. All right. Well, let me get back into some triage. Any preference on where we start? Harry, you've got a couple PRs at least underway.
I think so, yeah, 685, since we're talking about breaking changes.
Yep.
If anybody else has thoughts, I think there is a conversation that we are going through of, yeah, that one. If you scroll down,
Yeah.
where you propose that if we default kind in the backend ref to service, then the shortcut and the backend ref has only a single line of difference.
Yeah.
So is the shortcut worth it or not? And is what we are discussing. In my preference, I think leveling the sort of playing ground between services and other references is better, because it removes a lot of corner cases like what this one is talking about. And it's just like having one way to do things. This is what something James had pointed out is just better, at least at this live stage of this API.
Yeah, I agree. It's not, when I look at these two examples, it is clearer to me what this means than what this means, right? This implies a kind service as a default, which I think is a very reasonable and necessary default here, but still it's not quite as clear for anyone reading it as this is. But with that said, I agree that just in terms of reliability and simplicity, almost having a single way to do things is going to be better than kind of two different ways. Like what we were running into that led to this discussion is, okay, well, if we add a namespace, where does that belong? Does it do we have, because we had either service name or backend ref. So do you have service namespace, or do you have backend ref dot namespace? And if you want to refer to a service in a different namespace, you have to use backend ref. Otherwise, you can use the service name shortcut. And and then what if both service name and backend ref are specified and they're different? We had conflict resolution guidance for that, but still, it's just one more thing you kind of have to deal with and think about as both a user and implementer. I don't have the strongest opinion on this, but I am also leaning towards just going back to the single way to do things, which would just be backend ref.
Rob, if you can scroll up a little, that provides, like, if we omit the default, this is how it would look like. So still not.
Yeah.
Some difference for sure. 2 lines.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess the other question I have is, no, we can't. I was going to ask if we could make the forward to a top, like get rid of backend ref, like just have everything be top level. Forward to name, port, etc. And kind. I need to look at this a little bit more.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah, I think that it could be possible, because if you don't have a special case, then it's just like a indent for no reason.
Right. So we have weight and filters. So we get I guess a little messy that you're including weight and filters inside the same thing as name and port. But if that's all, it seems fundamentally simpler to not have backend ref. Well, not have this extra indentation.
Yeah. My question there is that in any way going against a upstream API guideline?
Yeah.
Or not?
Yeah, it could be. Okay.
I think making the assumption that it's only going to be wait and filter, looking forward might be a little short-sighted.
Yeah, that's true. And another concern is I've started to recommend in 2 different proposals, I think both policy reference and the proposal we just looked at, to have lists actually have a name associated with them. So a listener could have an optional name, and similarly a route rule could have an optional name, so you can reference them by policy. And so if you're used to name in a list referring to like the name of this item, having a top level name field that refers to what it's forwarding to, instead of just this is the name of this item in the list, could get confusing. So, okay, that's enough to convince me that maybe we should just go towards backend ref and something like this. Does that?
Yeah, that makes sense. Do we need a gap for this to discuss this out before we merge this in, or should I update it here?
That's a good question. It is an API change. Why don't we test out the process and see how painful a gap is? The hope of a gap would be that it would be small enough, lighter weight than Kubernetes caps, and hopefully it wouldn't add too much overhead here. It would be nice to, it would be nice to document some of the alternatives we considered, instead of it just getting hidden in this PR. So yeah, this is a good, relatively small first gap. Yeah, thanks for the idea.
Okay, I'll take a stab at it later this.
Cool, thanks. The next one we should get through is, this is the actual gaps, which I think we're just waiting on one last change. The markdown link is confusing, but otherwise it's fine. Bowie also uncovered the one. I think hopefully this is the last place we're using service APIs as a name, but they just keep on coming out every now and then. I never thought of looking at service API singular plus apostrophe, like this particular incantation of service API. But it will be gone whenever this PR gets in.
Renames are a whack-a-mole.
Yes, who knew? And then this is a larger one from you, Harry. You saw this listed as a work in progress. Do you think I know there's been some discussion on here.
Is it still listed as a work in progress? Okay, that's my bad. I think
I don't know where.
I removed it. I
the
think
link
last
had it
week.
as a draft, but then, or I don't know. But
Yeah,
it doesn't look like it
GitHub.
here.
Yeah, that's a bug in GitHub, as it seems. So.
Okay, yeah, because this looks like not okay. Cool.
Yeah, so there was some feedback on adding an example in. So
yeah,
I added that, and then James had a couple of minor comments. So I just addressed this morning actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is.
Yeah, this is pretty close.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, this all looks very familiar. So it's just a new filter inside route that would be a redirect. And I think you add an example down here.
Yeah, so I added an example. So if you look at the gateway config up, if you scroll a little up, Rob, There are two
Yeah.
listeners, one on port 80, another on 443. Port 80
Mhm.
lists is selecting routes only from the same namespace. This is sort
Mhm.
of assuming that the gateway lives in a privileged namespace, and then so that route does the redirect, and the redirect only
Yep.
changes the protocol. So line 62, you can see it's only changing the protocol of the request, and then the listener or 443 selects routes from all namespaces with the label app filter. So that would work.
This is a dumb question, but do we need this? I can't remember if we allow matches to be empty.
This is not an empty match, right? This is like a path prefix match.
Well, no, like I guess what I was meaning there is this the default inferred value if we don't specify a match?
I think so, but this is just more self-documenting. So
Yeah, okay. Okay, got it. And there was okay, so no redirect here. So redirect as it exists, it does have a status code, and 301 and 302 and 302 is default. Okay.
I think 302 is the temporary one. I always
Yeah,
get confused.
yeah.
So that's why I picked that as a default.
Yeah, that seems reasonable. Okay. All right, yeah, this looks very close to me. I do remember going through this earlier. Great, yeah, let me take another look at it later today. But if anyone has any hesitation about this, add it to the PR soon. Otherwise, I just merged in. Cool. This is what got wait, that got merged? Okay. Okay. Just weird. All right. So request redirect. How did I miss this one? This is an empty. Oh, this is an ancient one. Yeah.
Yeah, this has gone stale. I think the only other PR we have is the recent PR is conformance.
Yeah, let me run through that. I meant to cover that in more detail. This is something that I updated relatively recently. You'll notice there's two commits now. The first commit uses GoDog. The second commit doesn't. So if you want to see with and without, it's now included in a single PR. Removing it was not that difficult. I'd say it's, so this PR is still very much a draft. I've been running through these tests with Contour and Istio just to get some variety in terms of, experience running conformance tests and how these implementations perform. So that's why this is still in here. It obviously should not merge that way. With that said, a large portion of the helper code is from the ingress controller conformance test suite. I'm trying to keep as much similarity as possible. But the big difference is that instead of using GoDog, I'm using just vanilla Go tests in this case. There are a few advantages of that. Like although we lose I kind of summarized everything here. But although we lose some of the, easy to read feature files that GoDog provides, I think this isn't that hard to read. It's fundamentally similar. It's just written a slightly different way. What I really liked about writing tests this way is, one, there was no more kind of extra layers of abstraction. So less could get broken in between just in how we're writing tests. And it was much easier to understand where a failure happened, because instead of, okay, so I look at this feature and then I try and find the function that's implementing that feature. And then, it's all in one fairly straightforward place. And then we also get intermediate logging output because we have access to the testing variables, where at least how the GoDog tests were set up, although it streamed output, it was not, we did not have access to t.log. So all that meant, at least as far as I could use it, if you had a long running test, you'd get output at the end of a test, of a specific test case. But if you had a test case that waited 3 minutes, there was no way, even with verbose settings, to get the intermediate output as that test was running, which you can obviously easily with this. I may just be missing something obvious, but that's how it was working with ingress controller conformance, and the only way I could get it to work here. So I'm pretty fine with this system, but I wanted to get a bit more feedback before I move much further on it. So if anyone has time to take a quick look, I'm not in any way trying to suggest this is ready to be merged in or anything. I just wanted to get some feedback on the structure and rough setup of these tests before I went too far into the details. But these work. I know they pass entirely on Istio. Last I checked, Contour was not setting status, and right now the first thing I'm testing is status, so that's not going to work. But yeah, that's the current state of these. And I think we're at time, so encourage anyone who has time to pull this up and give some feedback. But thanks so much to everyone for the feedback on this, and we'll talk to you in a couple weeks. Thanks.